say thank you for everyone for coming and joining us today. I'm here to do a bit of housekeeping. I'm not actually going to be participating in the webinar. My name's Charlotte and I am one of the consultants here at DPAS. So I've been given a list of things that I need to cover off. Please can everyone keep their microphones muted, camera switched off. The webinar will be recorded and it will be circulated a few days after. It's probably going to be the start of next week. So don't worry if you don't hear anything tomorrow. The plan would be to have a Q&A at the end. So feel free to put your questions into the chat throughout the day, the hour, sorry. And then we will go through them at the end. What else do we need to cover off? I think that's it. So if we can move on to introduction. So Theresa, if you could go first.
Yeah, sure. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the webinar. My name is Theresa Pollard. I'm the Deputy Data Protection Officer at Nottingham City Council, and I've worked in FOI and data protection since 2009 in other organisations, including a university and the BBC. So, yeah, hopefully you'll enjoy today and get something out of it. Thanks.
And Kim?
Yes, hi. So I'm Kim and I am the Information Governance Manager as well as the DPO for the London Borough of Barking and Dagenham. So I have quite a bit of experience in responding to FOIs, also at tribunal level. And yeah, so besides the data protection work, FOI is also on the another topic.
Thanks, Kim. And then David?
Hi, my name's David Brewster. I'm the Senior Information Officer for FOI at Nottingham City Council. I guess I'm here for kind of coalface experience, day-to-day experience of managing and responding to FOI requests, internal reviews and external reviews. So yeah, that's me.
Thanks, David. Okay, I'm going to hand back to Theresa now.
Hi, thanks, Charlotte. Yeah, so yeah, good afternoon, everybody. Appreciate you attending this webinar in probably what's a very busy day, possibly munching your lunch as you listen. So we only have an hour, so it's going to be a whistle-stop tour. But what I want to do is briefly look at some of the recent ICO FOI reprimands. I'm conscious that you may be busy FOI officers, managers, information governance managers, DPOs in your various organisations. You won't necessarily have time to read the full enforcement notices and the recommendations in practice. So that's kind of part of my role, really, just to see if we can get some key learning points and takeaways. I should say as a disclaimer that if any of the public authorities that have been issued these are attending the webinar, and at any point when we get to the question stage, do wish to chip in with their real life experiences of what actually went down with the ICO to kind of, you know, say it how it is, because obviously I've only read the notices on the ICO website. So I'm summarising them based on what was there, but perhaps, you know, might be very interesting if anyone can kind of chip in at the end with kind of what went down. So I'm going to take us through some of those, some real kind of takeaways, I think, as well. So that's kind of the key for today, for you guys to go away with a little bit more understanding of what it is the ICO are looking at, regardless of the stage your public authority is at, you know, whether you're really kind of hanging on the edge and you think you're just about to go into monitoring, whether you're kind of doing okay, but you could improve, or whether, you know, you've already been issued a reprimand and then kind of just want some kind of perhaps tips and even reassurance maybe of kind of how you're going with things, and also for obviously Kim and David and myself to share some really good practical experiences. So we're going to try and emphasize the practical tips part more, but I'm also happy to take kind of more technical questions as well. So first things first, really, when reviewing the ICO enforcement notices that have been issued, there's been a host of them come out in the last year. They really boil down to three key things. So regardless of the particular failings of the public authority in question, or regardless of what it was that actually, you know, led to the unfortunate situation with the FOIs, the ICO will pretty much always say three things. So they'll always want the public authority to come up with an action plan in 35 days. So that's a pretty tight turnaround, and that's something that they will emphasize. when you're talking about an enforcement notice as well, I should also say that, you know, you do need to bear in mind that you are obliged to comply. There is a legal obligation to comply, and you could be in contempt of court if you don't comply with an ICO enforcement notice. So this is your real kind of, for your senior management in your organisations, this is the real sit-up moment. Right, we've got to come up with an action plan. We've only got 35 days to do so. Regardless of the notice, I've pretty much seen a universal trend where the ICO will essentially issue an instruction to the public authority to also clear the backlog in 6 months. So again, I think we'll get into this when we start sharing kind of trench stories later on. But I think, you know, if you have a sizable backlog, then that is going to be a challenge. 6 months is not that long. And if you've got particularly limited resources, then we all recognise and we know that that can be a big challenge. So, but that's certainly something that the ICO will say without fail. I think on one occasion, they did give the authority 5 months. I think it was the Environmental Agency off the top of my head. So sometimes it will be shorter. It will never be more than 6 months. I think we can emphasise that. And then obviously back to basics, they'll also want to see a sustained improvement. So it's not just about the ICO saying, you know, get your backlog fixed and everything will be fine and dandy, because they'll actually want to see a sustained improvement. And particularly in some of the language that I've read that comes from the ICO in these enforcement notices, they do tend to emphasise that they want to see a sustained improvement. And on one particular occasion, they issued a recommendation, but then because the public authority in question didn't sustain the improvement, they actually came back with an enforcement notice. So again, I think that's something to bear in mind, particularly if you're having conversations with your senior management about resourcing and about kind of getting that kind of buy-in about improvement in performance. It's something to just kind of bear in mind that the ICO can come along at any stage, and they often will usually follow up for quite a sustained period of time with public authorities. So it's not just a case of, oh, we've cleared the backlog, you know, we got the compliance rate to 90 for 1 month, everything's fine. They do look at kind of the trends, and they will keep coming back to the public authority in question for reporting figures. So I think really one of the takeaways I'd suggest is useful for today, if you haven't already had these conversations with senior management, is about sustainment. It has to be a sustained kind of improvement that's shown, and that's really what the ICO is looking for, that kind of long-term ability. We can, you know, we've really got ourselves sorted out. We've not just kind of got 7 temps in for 3 months to sort of bang out some responses, and then they're gone, and then we're back to where we started. I don't know anyone that's hired 7 temps, by the way. It's certainly not happened at Nottingham City Council. But yeah, just to bear that in mind. So they're the kind of general messages, and I think if you're kind of having those conversations with senior management, you're perhaps struggling for FOI resources and getting some kind of traction in terms of those arguments. These are kind of 3 clear, concrete things. So regardless of the public authority, the type of public authority, it will be that the ICO will always be looking for these 3 things to be complied with. So they're kind of key messages, really. I think we'll go to the next slide, if that's okay, Charlotte. Thank you. Thanks so much. So in a bit more detail, I just wanted to highlight 3 of the most recent enforcement notices, actually, that the ICO have issued. Again, going back to my earlier point about, you know, perhaps being time strapped and you're not necessarily able to read them in detail. What I thought was quite interesting with the City of York's enforcement notice, particularly because I think, you know, for all the local authorities attending, hands up here, you know, myself and David and Kim are all working in local authorities, and you know, let's suffice to say they're not having the best of times lately nationally. We've had the recent, obviously, Birmingham City Council Section 114 notice. It's no secret now that Nottingham is kind of on a similar trajectory, and you know, we've got really challenging times in terms of resources. And I think, you know, I know I've worked in a local authority for 9 years. I know that the kind of cycle of arguments about resources that goes on, but in City of York's experience, I think it's almost like the subtext of what wasn't kind of written in the enforcement notice, that the ICO knew that they'd had a kind of backlog, but it was particularly that some of the requests were very old. So I think the takeaway for that is just thinking, if you and your public authority are starting to see that you've got piles of really overdue cases. You know, we're talking going back 6 months, 1 year, 2 years. I think the Ministry of Defence had, you know, some going back to 2014. You know, again, probably extreme kind of circumstances there. I'm sure COVID was a factor, but I certainly think that's something to avoid if at all possible. And I think the takeaway, and we'll talk about this a bit more in the practical tips, but from my personal experience with dealing with severe overdue FOIs, in one case I had one which was over 2 years old when I joined the local authority. And I think it's just that sense of almost, it becomes like a dusty book that's on the shelf and it gathers dust because nobody wants to kind of touch it. It's so old. It's actually just about kind of saying, right, let's put a system in place. We're really busy with the constant flow of requests, but can we perhaps look at kind of, you know, the old ones each month, and can we set aside, you know, a few hours each week or each month as a team? You know, no matter if there's one of us, two of us doing FOIs, however small our team might be, can I just commit to that regular review? And actually, can I move those cases forward on a regular basis? Because again, that's what the ICO are looking for. They're not looking for perfection, but they're looking for public authorities to demonstrate that kind of regular progression. And again, I think that helps with managing the requesters' expectations, which we'll come on to a bit more later when we talk about practical tips. So that's kind of something. I don't know if David or Kim want to comment at all about the overdue, the kind of the dusty old cases at all. Happy for you guys to interject.
I think from my perspective is that I guess within the local authority context, and I'm sure it's the same in other public authorities, there's quite a high turnover of staff. So as you can imagine, once you get stuff that's potentially a year or 2 years old, you potentially, the people that were directly involved in that decision making no longer work for the public authority. So you're almost having to start from square one again, and invariably that pass on of knowledge, that handover of knowledge when someone leaves the organisation isn't as great, as Theresa's mentioned about a reduction in resources. So I guess that's why it's imperative as much as possible to stay on top of those overdue requests, because I guess, you know, as an FOI officer that deals with requests every day, your inclination is just to deal with the new requests all the time, because it ensures that you hit your compliance rate and, you know, you don't get as many complaints. But those old ones can still generate complaints and invariably lead to enforcement from the ICO.
Thanks, David. Yeah, I think the other thing to highlight there that I didn't highlight is the fact that York had an 85.5%. So actually their compliance rate was pretty decent, really, not quite at 90, but it was the old cases that really kind of unfortunately led to the enforcement notice, I think, being issued. I think with the environmental agency, the interesting point there was the fact that the ICO particularly criticised them for not actually being able to report on their figures initially, and the EA did kind of sort of essentially put the hands up from what I can see in the notice, where they essentially said, yes, we actually have struggled to keep accurate records because we're such a large organisation with regional hubs, which are, you know, as someone who hasn't worked in that kind of organisation, I can heavily sympathise and can only imagine the challenges there. So that was an interesting takeaway. I thought that actually the battle sometimes is just almost going back to basics and keeping kind of that good log of what's coming in each day, what the request is. Yeah, sorry, David, did you want to add something into that?
Oh, sorry, I was only going to say that, yeah, on that point is, you know, I'm sure we're all aware of the problems in organisations of people, officers assuming in other departments that the clock only starts when the request is received by the FOI team. So it's that reinforcing of messaging all the time that as soon as the organisation receives the request, it's a valid FOI request. And I guess with the Environment Agency, there'll be EIR requests as well, which can be made verbally, as we all know. So there'll be issues with that, I would imagine. So
yeah, they mentioned that obviously the overwhelming majority, EIRs. And again, if we've got anybody from more of an environmental organisation or even the EA, interesting to see what was said there. And then finally, I just want to make sure we're keeping to time. The Ministry of Defence, again, it was this real kind of sense of internal contacts. And I think I would say, particularly again in this Shropshire enforcement notice, I think this is an interesting quote from the ICO, that they actually criticised. There was a kind of almost like a kind of inadvertent criticism that it's not of FOI officers, but possibly of a public authority if it's set up its own FOI resource in a way that means that it's so heavily devolved, you don't actually have any central contact. So I think this is, we'll come on to this a bit later, but I think this is almost like the strange paradox of FOIs, if you like. You almost have to have that central point because you have to have someone who's kind of controlling, advising on exemptions, you know, is accountable to the ICO and can keep those kind of good records, and obviously is the kind of, you know, one-stop shop for FOI knowledge. But then you also are so heavily reliant on your actual information holders, or to not use any jargon, the people that know about the stuff that you're being asked about, really. So that's kind of key, I think, just to kind of have that good kind of combination, and it can be really tricky to get right, to get the balance right. I think if you go too heavily devolved, the danger is that you end up with you know, you get into hot water with the ICO if you don't have a good kind of clear record of your FOI requests received by the organisation. You don't have that single central point of contact. You know, perhaps the quality of responses is reduced. But equally, I think if there's no connections with the different departments and teams that hold the information and are the subject experts, then your FOI resource is going to really struggle. And I'm sure some of you will speak as to that later. So it's kind of about getting that balance. Yeah, Kim, I don't know if you want to add anything on that.
Yes, so definitely, as you say, Theresa, the key is to have as much a centralized point as possible. In this way, you're able to record the FIs that come in. But besides that, is also to ensure that staff are aware of how to recognize an FIR request, because sometimes it's not sent to the FIR box, it's sent directly to a service. So they need to be able to recognize that perhaps amongst a complaint, and that actually this is an FIR request. And then they need to know, what does that process look like to send it to the FII team, and to be aware that, you know, the clock starts, as David says, ticking immediately when it's received. So it's to have a written process, guidance, hold regular workshops, and engage with the services so they are aware of, right, this is what an FIR request would look like. If you're not sure, contact us. You know, so it's also that as well.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. Is it okay if we go on to the next slide? Because I think lots of stuff that you guys are going to say will come up in the practical tips. I'm just going to say about the action plan, and then I'll pass over to you. So I think this was the other point, obviously, in terms of some of the enforcement notices. They really kind of, the ICO emphasised, I think I'll put it really bluntly, they basically were like, you need to look at the problem. So if you're a public authority and you have a problem with FOIs, the best thing you can do is actually just face up to the issue and kind of address it head on. I think the ICO talk a lot about the language of engagement, but also just almost like an honesty and an openness. So I think there's kind of sometimes that you know, the ICO will come in, and the particularly more experienced officers will be able to kind of quite quickly judge whether actually is this an organisation that knows it has an issue, usually because of resources or some other pretty good reason, but is tackling it and is doing its best with the limited resources that it has, or is it just burying its head in the sand, and is it kind of ignoring the problem, and the problem's just getting bigger and bigger? And I think that's what they really are emphasising in the City of York enforcement notice. This quote from the ICO, they were just saying, really kind of look at what's going wrong and at what stage is it going wrong. So is it right at the beginning, like Kim has said, you know, perhaps your staff are missing FOI requests because they don't know how to recognise them because you haven't got any sort of training or messaging out? Is there kind of a lot of FOI myths going around about kind of it has to say FOI or something that, you know, that we've all heard time and time again? Are they getting lost in the complaint? You know, is there a kind of long 4-page complaint and then a sneaky FOI at the bottom that has been missed, and then that request has gone to the ICO, which is their right to do? So they're the kind of things, but I think it's just, again, that language of just looking at what is the problem, what stage is the problem at, and then kind of having that kind of journey. And I think that's what these guys are, we prepared a slide to just with some practical tips to look at your kind of FOI flow, if you like, just kind of right from beginning to end. So these are some practical tips, and I'll really hand it over to these guys, but I'm more than happy to chip in. But I don't know if you want to take some of the points at the beginning, Kim and David, and just kind of talk through those, and also any others, because I know you'll both have a host of things that you adopt each day to kind of run things smoothly as possible. So
Yeah.
I'll hand over to you guys. Thank you.
Okay, so if we have a look at
sorry, Kim.
Sorry. So at the process, as I was saying earlier, have a look at what your process is. Is it working? Where is it falling? Where are the gaps? And certainly training staff to recognise what that FOI request is. And, is it a SAR? Is it a FOI? What does that look like? Getting it to this, if you've got a centralised team, getting it to them so that they can, record it and then send it out to the appropriate service for, responding to that type of thing. So certainly set out your process, make sure that the guidance, you have written guidance on what that looks like. And also, for instance, like when it comes to responding to reviews, have your process set up. What do your review processes look like, and have that written down. David?
That's great. Thanks, Kim. I don't know. Triage. Did you want to talk about triage, David? Just kind of what you do in terms of daily review and kind of looking at the requests when they come in. Not sure if David can hear me. Nod if you can.
Sorry about that. My video froze temporarily. So sorry, I might have missed a lot of what Kim was saying.
I just said if you want to talk about, so really what we do at Nottingham City Council in terms of triage. So like basically when the request comes in, what do we do to kind of, as Kim said, almost like look at what's being asked and pushing it out to the right people. So, that's kind of, I thought you could sort of explain what you do on a daily basis.
Yeah, so we have a daily meeting. I mean, we're a team of two that deal with FOIs at the City Council. So myself and the information officer have a daily meeting. We review everything that's in our FOI inbox, review everything. I think it's that review and understand what's being asked, and because so often you'll get requests where there are nuances in the wording of the request, and if you misinterpret it day one, then invariably it can go to the wrong person or to the wrong team, and then you only find out on day 17, 18, oh, actually, I've been doing 12 other things. I've had the chance to look at it now, and I've realised actually you need to send X, Y, and Z to another team within the authority to deal with. So I think it's that understand and engagement with the information holder from as early as possible, get stuff out to people as quickly as possible. I think what we try to do within Nottingham is if preempting potential exemptions or exceptions under EIRs. So if looking at the request, actually we've identified, it looks like potentially this could be quite a huge manual task to put the information together. All of a sudden we're already thinking about section 12, potentially section 14, depending on if it's a significant volume of information. Obviously, if it's based around financial information that we don't normally publish, is there thoughts about section 43 about commercial harm? Or so I think if we can guide information holders as early as possible, what I try to do is if possible, send them, if we've been asked for the same information previously, send them copies of previous responses. So whilst it might not be exactly the same information, they can understand the flow of how to answer the request, what we've done previously. Oh, actually, we've got 2 years worth of the same data that's being asked for here. We only need the last year's worth of data. So it's that buy-in from officers, because I'm sure we all understand that, we're asking information holders throughout the authority to do things, but they've got their day-to-day jobs as well. So it's, I guess a lot of FOI is that goodwill thing, is getting that buy-in from information holders and senior officers. I think one of the things that Theresa mentioned earlier on about the pitfalls in terms of non-compliance with backlog is we have a sign-off process. So once we've got a response drafted, if there's any relevant legislation applied, then we'll send that to either a head of service or a director to approve. If it's about a particularly contentious subject or from a journalist, we'll run it past our comms team. The messaging that I always try to say to people is, in a lot of ways, think of FOIs in the same way as you think about a press release. So it's a statement to the public about what you're doing and why you're doing it. The person who's asking for the information might not necessarily understand the nuances of what you do on a day-to-day basis. So figures that can look fairly normal to you, because, in social care, you're dealing with thousands of cases and whatever, actually to Joe public could look quite alarming. So actually, alongside getting the information, sometimes it might be worthwhile to add that additional context in. I think that utilization of exemptions is really important. I mean, within the authority, I've worked for the team for over 10 years. We pushed quite early on to make sure that our responses were really detailed. So when we were applying FOI exemptions and exceptions, we were clear, because I've read other authorities' responses and they can be quite brief. And whilst for some people that's great, actually it can lead to further complaints. And we actually found the number of internal reviews we received declined dramatically the more detail we could put in the use of an exemption for a particular piece of information. I think just going back to one of the points that Theresa was raising earlier on, we had a case recently where a team had been dealing with a complainant for a number of months about a separate issue. Within that complaint, there was an FOI. It was completely missed. I got a rather nasty email from the ICO asking us why we hadn't responded to the request, and it was news to the team that an FOI had been submitted. We went back through the correspondence, were able to identify it. So I think that was a failing in the organisation of not understanding and appreciating what an FOI request was. And I think in this case, they hadn't mentioned the legislation, but it was clear it was recorded information. They hadn't responded with the information as part of a business as usual practice. So then I guess the question for those departments is, if someone's asked for a clear piece of recorded information, you're not going to give it as BAU, then should it then be dealt with as FOI? And that's a triage that needs to be taking place within departments across the authority, really. The only thing I would say is we have GDPR, obviously, is still a relatively fresh piece of legislation. We have an annual training that every officer in the authority has to do. Within that training, there are slides about FOI and EIR, not loads, but just enough to reinforce those messages about what an FOI request is, how do you deal with it, who you need to contact, simple, regularly used exemptions and exceptions. So if you've got that sort of training and you haven't maybe got FOI slides within there, then that might, because you can get a bit training overload within the authority. Everyone has to do, if you're anything like us, having to do training all the time. But those key recurring annual training courses, if you can sneak some FOI stuff in there, I'd take advantage of that.
Yeah, thanks, David. I had a bit of a coughing fit there, so it's actually quite useful that you were talking, but I think my voice is going a little bit. But yeah, I don't know if I've slightly, we're on track in terms of kind of, I think we've talked around some of these practical tips. There's been one or two questions in the chat, but we're trying to answer those as well. But just a reminder that if anybody does want to post any more, we're more than happy. I think it's actually sometimes easier for you guys to interact and ask us questions, because that might, particularly things that you might be struggling with at the moment. I sometimes remember, I don't know if Kim and David can attest to this, but you can feel a little bit isolated because you're kind of, you're one or two FOI people in your very large organization with thousands of members of staff, and perhaps if we're being honest, it's not always considered as a priority by the particular organization. The FOI kind of slight kind of overload, and they don't produce anything, they don't kind of they don't benefit the authority. That's kind of often a perception of dealing with them. So you already kind of got that negativity bias with senior management. So we're conscious of people perhaps feeling a bit isolated. So it's a good opportunity to ask any questions. I don't know if you want to, Kim, did you want to add to that at all?
Yes, so just having a look at working with contacts, this is very important, and to engage with them, speak about FOI, and also just bring across the so lots of people see FOI as, and given they've got their tasks to get on with, so I try and remind people that this is actually part of your customer service. Yes, it is a legal obligation. We have to comply, but also have a look at the customer service. We want our customers to be happy. We want to be seen as a transparent public authority. And at the end of the day, it's also about our reputation as well. So engage with them. Look at suggestions. How do they work? Who holds a lot of information around there? You might find somebody who's been with the organization for 10, 15 years, and they have a wealth of knowledge around that. Have you considered freedom of information champions? Those experts within each service area, that perhaps you can form a group that could meet regularly and have a look at problem FOIs they might be dealing with, or not problem ones, but challenging ones. And also to engage with the ICO. I have had really some good interaction with the ICO around this, and they really are helpful, and they do want to help you. So that is another option to consider as well.
Yeah, I'd reinforce that, Kim, actually, in terms of engaging with the ICO, especially when I've dealt with external reviews. I try and create that dialogue with the case officer as soon as possible, because I think understanding what they're looking for, the concerns that they may have, actually a lot of what they're asking for you may have done already as part of your process in terms of applying an exemption, and actually there isn't as much work as it might appear when you first received that complaint. But we've also engaged with the ICO when at the point of receiving an FOI request, when we thought, actually, how does this exemption work with this particular piece of information? So I think I'm trying to think, we had an example where we have a statutory duty to publish a certain register under a different piece of legislation, and we were just trying to work out the relationship between that piece of legislation and the FOI Act, and whether the ICO felt actually our application of Section 21 in that case was valid. And they were like, yeah, and they gave us really good advice. They looked into the legislation. So I think that engagement with them is really important. And just as Kim was saying, relationship building. I always say, actually, the easiest part of the job in a lot of ways is applying the legislation, because the ICO provides so much guidance and there's so many decision notices out there. Actually, the difficult part of the job is building relationships with people throughout the organization and just managing a high volume of work and that regular deadlines that is very different to a lot of other services in public authorities. So it's a skill set in itself, I think. So actually, what other parts of the organisation are particularly good at managing a high volume of work? Is there anything you can learn from them, or the shared experiences? So yeah, don't just see yourself as an island. You're part of a wider organisation. There's lots of shared experience there, I think.
Yeah, that's really good. I think there's some really interesting tips being shared on the chat. I can see quite a lot of people are picking up on the issue about kind of having contacts. So I think Kirsty has said about having kind of FOI contacts list. And I think definitely that's something that we found to be really key. Having that kind of relationship, that building kind of just that kind of dialogue. I think one of the cases that sticks in my mind, even though it was some years ago, and I practice more in data protection in the last few years than FOI, but when I was dealing more with FOIs, we had a decision notice case, actually, one of the few decision notices we've been issued, and it was all stemming from essentially quite a significant miscommunication with senior staff, because they didn't understand. So they didn't understand why we needed information to apply an exemption. And I think that's kind of at the heart of it, that sometimes, and I don't know if other organisations can attest to this, but certainly in my experience, the subject matter was a little bit controversial. Essentially, the Nottingham City Council had done a campaign about giving money to charity rather than giving money to beggars. You might remember it. It was in the media. It was quite high profile. They were known as the anti-begging posters. Not sure if anybody remembers that. There was significant media coverage. I just share this because I know other public authorities will probably have other kind of media like requests. Anyway, so to cut a long story short, we essentially reached a stalemate because we had senior staff really concerned about how we were to respond to a request asking us about the rationale for the posters, so internal decision making, also asking us who produced the posters. There was a real concern, and a valid concern, from senior management about essentially harassment. So they were genuinely concerned for the safety of the staff because of the controversy of the, so I think this is kind of, I'm speaking to FOIs about controversial matters, which are kind of their own unique beast, if you like. And I think the discussions really that I had with senior staff, I think once we actually got down to it and we got down to the essential question, which I think every FOI officer needs to remember, that if somebody expresses, I don't want to give this information out, if it's a kind of immediate barrier up, I think the key question to ask is, could you just explain to me why? You know, is it about reputational risk? Are you concerned about individual staff members? Is there a concern that perhaps we didn't like our decision? Actually, as an organisation, we don't particularly want to air our decision in public. You know, is there a commercial angle? We all know about Section 43 and the challenges with the public interest test. But there's, I think it's that dialogue that's key. And I think if you don't get that initially, it can be very difficult. And actually, as an FOI officer, it can end up making your job a lot harder, because you're then kind of almost in a kind of at an impasse, I think, where the appropriate information isn't being shared about having to apply the exemption and advise on it. And I'm sure that many of you attending today have had that experience, but eventually we did manage to resolve it. We applied the exemptions really successfully, and the ICO did uphold our decision because they upheld our application of the exemptions. But it was getting to the heart of why the exemptions applied. And I think that's kind of, like I say, that key question for me that I think about it years later. I still think I wish I'd been more articulate and asking at an earlier stage, is just why were the senior managers concerned about the information going out? Forget about the FOI Act. You know, you're there to advise on that. That's your job, is to have that knowledge. But they need to tell you why they don't want the information going out and what their concerns are. And it's almost, you tell me so then I can do my job. And I think me and David have a mantra that if there is an exemption and it genuinely applies, and we should be applying it, we'll consider it and we'll look at it and we'll give it our very best shot. But we can't do that if we don't have that context. And I think that's kind of key. So yeah, sorry, I'm sure David's probably got other points to say on that.
No, I was only going to say that, yeah, I think the red flag for me as an officer is always when someone doesn't engage. It either suggests that they've done something wrong, or they're really concerned about the disclosure of that information. So someone being quiet is normally an extra motivation for me to pick up the phone or contact the on Teams or whatever it may be. In the old days, when most of us were in the office, going and standing at someone's desk and saying, let's go and have a chat about this, because a lot of, I'm sure we're all aware, a lot of times FOIs come about because someone's dissatisfied with a decision or an action taken by the public authority. They're very rare. Okay, outside press requests maybe, or businesses looking for information to pitch their next new piece of software to the local authority. A lot of requests from citizens are to do with, they feel like they've had a really bad interaction with the authority, and this is a last resort. So it's picking out, like almost removing the situation from the request and going back to the request, and it's on its own merits.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to pick up on Karen's point, just to make sure that we're keeping on top of the questions and comments. But I think, certainly Karen Hayward has just said we set a 5-day internal deadline. We have the same. So you're the only FOI officer. Oh, Karen, yes, we feel your pain. They can be quite rude. I mean, with regards to practical tips, I don't know, David and Kim, I'm sure have them, but I would probably go back to emphasising that, like quite a lot of compliance issues, perhaps not that different from, health and safety, or I don't know what sector you're in, but there may be other areas you can draw on to say, actually, FOI might not be anybody particularly wants to do it as an organisation, but it is a legal requirement and it's a statutory requirement. We have to comply with it. And actually, as Kim had said earlier, it can be quite a useful way to say to senior management, well, we take customer care quite seriously, actually. If we've got customers, we've got clients, we've got stakeholders, FOIs, as David said, often become quite loaded because people have made complaints or unhappy about a decision or the way that something's been handled. So I certainly sometimes have used that angle before, where I've said, appreciate, then they're not necessarily everybody's favourite thing to deal with. And have quite a negative bias in some organisations, but just having that kind of, we do have to do them. We kind of need to just perhaps make the conversation more positive. I mean, I'm going hoarse now, Karen, you said you're going hoarse, my voice is going. But I think the rudeness probably stems from perhaps like like David said, either there is a sensitivity around what's been asked. Maybe someone's thinking, I really don't want these emails to go out, and actually I don't really like what we said, and I'm concerned about how it could look, or they're just really strapped for time, and pulling together some data to answer the request is really not something that they've got the resources to do. So I don't know if you guys, another question, should I throw this over to you and David and Kim? We've got what are the most common reasons for refusing FOIs? Do you guys want to take that? That's come from the chat. Over to Kim, maybe. Do you want to tackle that one?
Okay, I just don't want to talk over anybody. All right, so I guess the most common ones would be around Section 40, personal information, Section 12, certainly, and also Section 43, commercial interest. And what I usually, so we have templates to respond to that, but when we're responding, for instance, if we are considering to rely on Section 12, then I say to the team, right, have you done a sample exercise? Yes, I get that what you're saying about, it's going to take too much time, but do a sample exercise. I said, because if this goes as a complaint to the ICO, or if it comes back as a review, we're going to ask these questions anyway. What did you do a sample run? And then we go through that. And a lot of the time they're actually right on the mark. It is going to take over the 18 hours, but then at least we have got the evidence. We can evidence that we have done our homework around it. We have looked at it. We've looked at systems and, calculated approximately how long this is going to take. But having a look at responses and the volume of FOIs that an organisation might receive, is that also have a look, and can you be proactive in publishing information on your website that is, asked for quite a bit? Do you get are you finding yourself responding to FIIs over and over where they might have asked for the same information? Have a look, can it just be published? So when you receive information, a request relating to that, you can immediately apply Section 21 and provide the link to them. Also with the local government, as we know, we have the Local Government Transparency Code, and there's information that we have to publish anyway. But as I said, can we add to that? You know, can services, and we try to explain to services, yes, you get in a large volume, but is there information that you're asked for over and over again? And can you perhaps put that on your website? In that way, you can reduce your FIIs as well. And that's it from me.
Yeah, I think
Thanks, David.
linking back in with what Kim was saying about Section 12, the cost limit. I recently had a case, an external review about the application of Section 12, and one of the first questions the ICO officer asked me is, have you done a sampling exercise? Because the thing to remember is the ICO are just as stretched as public authorities. They're giving us less time to respond to external reviews because their resources are stretched. So they're looking at ways to shorten their process. So the case officer was asking me for this sampling exercise, because if we could provide that, then she could see straight away, oh yeah, I can see how you've been able to demonstrate that it would exceed the cost limit. And the officer was almost suggesting to me, providing that alone would be able for her to uphold our decision in the first place. So actually putting in that legwork early on is really important. I think, again, as Kim was saying, Section 21 and 22, so information published or information that's due to be published, are commonly used exemptions within Nottingham. Nottingham used to have a data hub about a year ago. Due to cuts and stuff, that service was managed by a different team. It's now come under my team, so we've had to review how we publish stuff, how we're meeting our statutory requirements as a local authority, but also under the FOI Act. So we publish all our statutory data, but we also publish additional data that we're regularly asked for. So as a public authority, we're regularly asked about business rates data, for example. We publish that on a quarterly basis. We're regularly asked about penalty charge notices, because if you work for a public authority, or if you ever received a PCN and you want to appeal it, people seem to think that this evidence will help their appeal process. So it's quite time consuming for officers to produce that data. So we publish that on a quarterly basis. So I think, yeah, the other exemptions, the other exemption that we quite regularly use is Section 31, prevention, detection of crime, which isn't necessarily as obvious in the first place if you don't work in a crime agency, but actually there's lots of applications of that in a public authority context. So I think it's really thinking about that. And one thing that always sticks with me, when I went to a PDP conference a number of years ago, someone from the ICO came along and they were saying that not enough public authorities were using Section 14. Section 14 was there as a tool to use. I think the word vexatiousness often clouds our judgment about how that exemption should be used, but actually under Section 14 it can be considered almost as an extension of Section 12, whereas under Section 12 you can't consider the redaction exercise. Potentially under Section 14 you can, because of if you've got a huge volume of information, say for example correspondence about a huge subject, and that correspondence is likely to include not only personal data but potentially commercially sensitive data. If it's about social care, maybe it could put the health and safety of individuals at risk. So actually think about Section 14 as a potential exemption to use, and look at some of the decision notices around the use of that exemption.
Thanks, David. I've been typing away. I hope that people attending have seen. I'm doing my best to answer some of the questions that Charlotte's filtering through. We've been given our 5-minute warning, so I just want to wrap it up. Again, really happy to take questions. Thank you so much. It's really, really good. We've had things like kind of the training is key. I think even training FOI officers, Tim and David and Kim, it's really tricky. I think we've got such limited resources. We can't often send staff, you know, to do the BCS or equivalent qualifications initially, perhaps. But what we often emphasize is, you know, there's no better way to learn than by doing, to jump in. A lot of shadowing, I think, is good. If you do have the capacity, just having, there's nothing like really just taking some of the easier responses, just reading past responses as well, seeing how they've been done before, but also taking advantage of the ICO guidance. I cannot emphasize the amount of times I always have gone back to read the ICO guidance. Karen says she's doing the practitioner course. I mean, it is fantastic if you can go on those courses, but also taking advantage of free webinars. And as staff, I think developing your knowledge of the organisation itself, because that's kind of a really good way to get yourself embedded and get the reputation, turning it around as more of, you know, you actually, yes, you've got these requests to deal with, but you're not the ones writing them. I think that's sometimes, you know, just making sure that your staff, reading decision notices that is so helpful, because you could see the logic of how the ICO has said this exemption applies. Jeanette's saying, I'm just going to plug, there was a slide about the ICO toolkit. I'm very quickly going to say, please emphasize that is really useful, and the ICO in every single enforcement notice pointed to that. So there's loads of really good guidance there about how to start, you know, perhaps with an action plan, or how to measure your performance against what the ICO are looking for. Really useful. Sorry, right, questions. Cannot always find the free webinars. I agree with you. There's more on data protection than FOI. This is a good one. Obviously, this is a good start. Thank you to the organisation BPAS for running this. Right, so data not held, Holly. I would suggest that I think it's really thinking, no, it doesn't have to be back. So this is a good one, section 1. So do we actually hold the information? Really thinking about what the question is asking for. Is it asking for documents? Is it asking for correspondence? And I think it can be quite difficult to really get under the bonnet, but once you do, actually having a conversation with the person that seems to know the most about the request can be challenging to find that person. But once you find them, just saying, what do you think? Is it actually, were there some emails about this? Were there some kind of, you know, were there some email? Was there a meeting about this? Were there minutes of that meeting? Was this something that actually was just a conversation? You know, do we record this data? Do we need to record it? Is there a statutory obligation? So they're the kinds of things I'd look for. I think section 1. I don't know. Sorry, Kim, you had your hand up. I don't know if you. I was just
going to say on section 1, I get told quite a lot, oh, we don't hold this information, and invariably you find that the authority does hold the information. We just don't necessarily report it. So it's then getting them to think, well, actually, is it potentially section 12 that we need to think about rather than section 1? But yeah, I think just establishing whether it is or isn't held. Do you have the building blocks to be able to provide that information?
Sorry, and I think someone just commented about the opinion. So again, the section 1, I mean, sometimes they can filter into a kind of giant rant and wanting us to kind of make a new, you know, possibly we're going into section 14 territory that David already covered. But I would say I've argued that many times that we are not obliged. Remember, the legal obligation is not to create new information, it's for recorded information. So that's a really good conversation to have with senior managers. Equally, what you do need to be careful of is the legal obligation. If there is recorded information about this decision, it might be that the organisation doesn't like the decision it made. It might be that we've changed our mind about the decision we made. It might be we've had a lot of scrutiny publicly about the decision we made. But ultimately, if there is recorded information, I mean, we can all think about the recent COVID inquiry and the WhatsApp messages. You know, if there is recorded information about a decision that the organisation holds, it does fall within scope. It may be that a relevant exemption applies, but actually I think that's the starting point. I'd always emphasize that too when you're having your kind of internal conversations. Kim, did you want to come in on that? Sorry.
Actually, that's pretty much what I've said, and I think it's been answered here, is that look for regional FOI groups that you could perhaps join, you know, and that type of thing could also be helpful.
Yeah, I think it's about the feeling isolated. I'm sure that's a common experience. I'm just quickly going down this list to see if there's anything that we've missed. I think Lynn sharing some kind of some webinars. Yeah, that's really good. I mean, there isn't that much out there, but it is what is out there. Often I think you find disc mail as well. There's a useful kind of DP and FOI kind of practitioners will often post questions, and anybody can join. You don't have to be a university. That's how it started, but actually there's lots of practitioners from all fields across there. So it is really useful. I don't know if we've got any more time for questions or if it's back to Charlotte. But
I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap it up
yeah.
there.
Thank you, Charlotte.
Guys,
Thanks.
that really was great. So if anyone's got any more questions, then please feel free to drop us an email. We'd be happy to help. One of the things that I've been asked to do is just to inform you about the upcoming training that we have. In addition to this, we are also offering anyone who's turned up to our webinar to have 20% off. Again, if you've got any questions about this, please feel free to drop us an email. But apart from that, oh, almost forgot, we've also got our conference in January. If you want to attend, just go on our website. You should be able to find a link to Eventbrite. But I think that's it. So thanks for joining, everyone.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm more than happy as well. I'll share my email in the chat. So if anybody's got any questions that I didn't manage to cover, I'm happy to kind of receive any more questions as well. Thanks so much, everybody, for your questions. Thank you.